I'm Charlene Jorgensen. Welcome to Quilting from the Heartland. Today we're going to work with a quilt block called the Double X. The Double X quilt block is just simply two shapes. There are two sizes of the half square and a smaller square. These shapes will be coming from Pandora's box. When you put 4 of the Double X blocks together, you get a block that resembles an 8-pointed star, and each of these blocks are turned a quarter of a turn when they're put together. This particular block is using just 2 prints in it. The green is in the smaller blocks, or in the smaller half squares, and the red is in the larger half squares. But today I'm not going to work with just 2 colors of fabrics. I'm going to try to show you how to keep control when you use scrap fabrics in a design like this. The quilt that I have to show you is made up of scraps using a color palette which was green and red. And I used a little bit of gold in the design to get my scraps to stretch a little bit farther. When you look at the design, you'll see that I have the green in the larger half squares going in one direction and the red in the large half squares going in the opposite direction, forming a crisscross design in the quilt. Doing this will get your eye to go completely across the whole quilt instead of looking at just one area of the quilt. When I started running out of the green and red scraps, then I allowed myself to use a little bit of gold in the smaller half squares. If I would have put gold in the larger pieces, the design that I was trying to create would have been lost. All of the stars are set on a beige background in each block, and then the blocks in between the stars are also beige, making it look like the designs are floating on top of the quilt. There is a wreath machine quilted in between blocks, and they are surrounded with an all-over stippling machine quilting design. The outside border on this quilt has a couple of plaids in it. The inside one is a small check, and then it's bordered on the outside with a larger uneven plaid. And you might notice that I have not been very careful at all to match the plaids in the corners of this quilt. That was done on purpose because I wanted the overall effect of this quilt to appear like it was an antique quilt. The outside edge of the quilt was then finished off with a binding of the red that was lining the inside of the quilt. Let's take a look at the fabrics that I have selected to show you today, and let me share with you how I picked the palette for this quilt that I'm working on. Like I told you before, you go to your sewing room and pick out all the fabrics that fall into the palette that you've decided to use, and this time it happened to be red and green. I tried to pick fabrics that all portrayed the same mood. And to show you an example of what I wouldn't use in this quilt would be this red fabric, which appears too cheery. Now I wanted this quilt to portray the mood that it was looking old, so this fabric just wouldn't belong with the rest of them. Then after you have picked all of the fabrics that have the same mood, you need to decide which fabrics don't fall into the Then you need to decide, how far you want that color range to go. And let's take the reds and separate them from the greens, and let's look at how far the color range does go before I remove some of them. I removed this one because I thought the background of it was too light, and this one was a pastel, so I didn't want to use that one. Then all of these seem to be okay, except the last one over here I thought was too dark, and it didn't belong with the rest of them. So that's how you determine how far you want the color range to go in each of the color groups that you have picked. And the same thing would be true over here with the greens. I would have removed this particular one, again, because I thought it was just too light to go into the quilt. Then over here I have some fabrics that were hard to to use because I didn't know if they really were green or red, and this one is a good example of that. And I have a block to show you that is sewn together, showing you why I didn't use it in the quilt on the wall. It doesn't really read red or green, it just doesn't belong in the quilt at all, so I didn't use it. The same would have been true for some of these other fabrics. I did allow myself, though, to use them in the smaller pieces in the quilt, but just not in the larger ones. So that's a good way of keeping control of your scraps. If you use colors from the whole color wheel, the quilt becomes very confused, it looks haphazard, and it's very hard to make the decision when you're putting a quilt like that together, trying to decide what looks good next to each other. So try to stay within a palette if you can. Another way to keep control of a scrap quilt is to repeat the same shapes throughout the quilt. And in this quilt, that's what we've done, repeated the same shapes of the half squares and the small square. And also by repeating the same background fabric is also a good way of keeping control of a scrap quilt. Then, like I told you a little bit earlier, to get my scraps to go a little bit farther, I used a little bit of gold in some of the corners of the blocks because I was running out of fabrics. Now I realize that we don't all have that many scraps in our sewing room, so a good way to make your scraps stretch is to go to your local quilt shop and purchase what they have called fat quarters. Now a fat quarter is a half a yard of fabric cut in half in the width of the fabric. So you have a piece of fabric then that's 18 inches wide by 22.5 inches wide. That's what they refer to as a fat quarter. Even though you're using scrap fabrics, you still have to pre-wash all your fabrics because you don't want them to bleed the first time you put the quilt in the laundry. And today we're not going to cut all of these pieces because I have already pre-cut some of them, but I'm just going to show you how I would cut some scraps and get them ready for the quilt. Now a lot of times our scraps are many sizes and shapes, and they have a lot of different, how can I say it? Many of our scraps are different sizes and shapes. But I just layer them on top of each other, and I try to be aware of the grain of the fabric when I place them on top of each other. And then I place the template up on top of them and just simply cut around it. And if you work on a small mat board, it's much easier to turn your work when you're cutting out the scraps. The first cut I make, I go backwards and then turn the board so that it's easy to make that cut, and then just follow the edge of the template and remove the scraps of fabric and then make the other cut. Now that's how easy it is to cut out your scraps. And when you were looking at the quilt in the beginning, you might have noticed that every single block in this quilt had different scraps in it. If I did repeat the fabric at all, I would have maybe repeated the same fabric in a small piece in another position in the quilt, but I tried not to put them next to each other at all. So what you do after you cut your large half squares is just put them up on a felt board, and that's something that I have added in my sewing room that makes it very easy for me to work. It's just simply a foam core board which I've purchased at my local photographer shop, and then I've made a pillowcase out of a flannel and slipped it over the top of it. It sits inside of an easel that's easy for me to move from one area to the other in my sewing room, but I like to use this for all of my design work. So after you've gotten your large half square cut, then you need to choose the opposite color. So over here I would choose a red to go with that one. And I won't show you how to cut the little half squares because you would do the same thing, just taking another piece of scrap fabric and cutting that out and filling in the area here. The one fabric that you're going to need to cut a lot of is the gold background, or it's actually an ivory, I guess, and I chose this color. It has a very antique appearance to it, and it looked so good with all of the scraps. When you're going to cut those particular pieces, I like to cut strips of fabric first. Put your mat board in front of you with the width of it going in this direction, and fold your fabric in half first and match up the selvages on one side, and then lay it down on top of the mat board, and if you don't have a long ruler, then fold it in half again. Now if you're not careful to get this laid out just right, you're going to end up with zigzag strips when you're done. So take the time to lay the fabric out real nice and flat, and that there be no wrinkles in it. And like I said, if you don't have the long ruler, you can use the shorter one. Match up the edge of the ruler with the second fold on the fabric and make your first cut. And then bifold the excess fabric up on top of the mat and turn your board so you don't disturb your fabric. Now take the little half square that you're going to use in the design. Now I have allowed this to move too far forward, so I'm going to do exactly what I told you not to do, and that's move the fabric down. Place the template up on top of the ruler and slide the ruler over so that the point of the template matches the edge of the fabric. And that's how you cut the strips for this particular piece. I do have to say before I cut this piece that the bias on this piece should be in the inside of the block, right in here. You don't want the bias to be on the outside of the block because it would start to sag if you did that. So make sure that every time you cut a piece like this, you know where you want the bias to be. Then after you have found the width of the strip, just remove the template and cut the strip. Now just leave your fabric folded in 4, like I had it when I cut the strip, and flip-flop the template going across that piece of fabric, and I'll be cutting 4 at a time. And again, flip it in the other direction. Notice that I have little fabric grips on the templates, and that will keep it from sliding when I'm cutting. Now some of you might have cutters in your sewing room that are starting to get dull. When that happens, your fabric will move on the end of your cut. And if you want to get more mileage out of your cutter, this is what you can do. Go to the top of your cut and make a little cut up there first, so that when you get to that end, your fabric won't shift. Then go back to the other end and make a cut going backwards, and then scoot your cutter going forward. That way you get a little bit more mileage out of a dull blade. If your cutter is really sharp, you just make a quick cut like that and go off the end, and everything will be fine. Just flip-flop the template going all the way across until you've used up all of the fabric. When you're going to cut for the little square, just simply lay the square up on top of the template, scoot the ruler over to the width that you need, and do the same for the square. Cut off the strip of fabric and then place your template down on the strip and fracture it at every square. That's how simple it is to cut the pieces for a scrap double X block. Now I'm going to take this block to the sewing machine and show you how to put it together. You can now see how easy it is to transport the pieces on a flannel board like this. It makes your design work so much easier and efficient when you do it that way. When you get to the sewing machine, you want to sew with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and there are several ways that you can achieve that. One would be by just simply putting masking tape to mark the area on your sewing machine. Or with this one, I have the option of programming the scant 1/4 inch by just touching a couple of buttons on the front of the sewing machine. The other method would be to use the special foot that's made for the sewing machine to give me the scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. I do prefer, however, to use this particular foot that has the wide mouth on it because I can see where I'm sewing so much easier. I do like to sew with cotton thread in my machine because I like to use the same thread that is the same fiber as in the fabric I'm going to use. When you start chain sewing, pick the pieces off that are similar to each other and start to chain sew the pieces together. When you start out chain sewing, hang on to thread behind the presser foot so that it doesn't go down into the feed dogs, and then guide your fabric through the area that you're sewing on with the fingers instead of using pins. Keep them together and just don't stretch on them, but just guide them with the tips of your fingers. And then grab a couple more pieces and continue on until you have put all of the half squares together. Then after we have got all of those sewed to make the single block, we're going to cut off the little ears, and I'll show you that in just a minute. I always keep a piece or two in the machine when I'm working on a block because it's much easier to start and stop when you do it that way. I said I was going to clip the little ears off, and what I do is cut the pieces at a 90-degree angle with a small scissor. I also find that it's much easier for me to work at the sewing machine if I have a small scissor there instead of a large one. Then after you have sewn the two pieces together, lay them down right sides to the top of the sewing machine and run your pointer finger through there and iron that seam open after you have finger pressed it. Ahead of time I have put some blocks together to do the whole design, and here are some half squares that are ironed, and then up here I have another unit that's ready to go together, and we'll just replace it with these. And now I'll show you how to put that particular part of the block together. So let's take those off now, and we'll put those together in one seam. Put these right side together and match up the corners like this. And again, I'm not going to do any back stitching because that only creates bulk in the corners. But just do a straight stitch about 10 to 12 stitches per inch. And then we'll put these two right sides together. When you're working on blocks like this or a whole quilt project, I do many of these at one time. I just don't work on one block at a time like I'm doing here today. You'll save a lot of time when you do it that way. Next, then you just simply cut the threads between the two, and again finger press first. I find that if I don't finger press first, I end up with some unwanted pleats in my seams. So it is time well spent. And also, if you keep the ironing board right next to your work area, I find that I do take the time to iron. If I have to get up and go to the ironing board, sometimes I get a little bit lazy and think I'll catch it later. Anytime you take the extra effort to do things like that, you'll be much happier with the work in the end. Now, to get the block that we were working on, you need to put these up to each other and make sure that they're arranged right, and put them right sides together and insert a pin right in the center of the block, or right in the center of the seam line, on the top and again on the bottom, and put a pin on the right side of that seam to hold it in place. Now, some of you might think it's easier if you put a pin on both sides, but I think it's just as easy to have just one pin. I find that the accuracy is good enough that way. Actually, I think that two pins make it difficult to get it as good. You just have to try what works for you and stick with what's best for you. I like to use a stiletto all the time when I'm machine piecing, and I guide my fabric with it, and slow down when you approach the pin, and if you're going to sew over it, go real carefully, otherwise pull the pin out. And then continue to the other end. And again, notice that I didn't do any back stitching at the end of that seam. And that's how easy it is to get a perfect corner when you're putting the pieces together, just by simply using that pinning technique. Then there's another unit that looks like this in the quilt down in here, and that has 2 half squares connected to this block down here. So let's put those together next, and I'll pull this one down here too. And we'll lay it down here so that it's easier to work with. We'll put this one on first, right sides together, and just match up the corner over here. And I'm going to sew with this piece on the top. And again, I don't do any back stitching at all. And then open that seam up, and I want to point out something here. You see over here we have the 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's the area that's going to be used in the next connecting seam. So we'll pay attention to that a little bit later. Now open this seam up, and again finger press first and press it, and then put the other piece on over in here. Before you put the other piece on, I like to trim off this little ear up here and then put this piece on. Anytime you can clean off the edges like that, it looks a lot better. Okay, that's how you make that unit. Then what you would do is put these 2 pieces together, and before we do that, I'm going to trim off this ear right here and press it open, and I'll show you how to put that piece together. Finger press again, always doing that first, and then taking the time to press it. And this will be a real easy piece for you to see the intersection on where I'm going to sew over. You don't need to use pins when you put these together, but just put right sides together, and the piece that has the corner that I want to sew over, that's the one that I put on top. So let's put those 2 together and then continue on and sew over that corner right here. Slow down when you approach those so that you make sure you get right over the point you want to sew over. And that's how easy it is to put these units together. Next, we're going to attach these 2 units together that we just got done making, and we're going to sew a seam right through here. I want to put this piece on top when I sew them together because it's much easier to get a perfect corner or a perfect point, and because I sew with this one on top, I'll be able to see the point I want to sew over. I won't need to use any pins when putting this together because there is just that one intersection and there's nothing below it that I need to match it to. Hang on to the tails of your thread when you start out so they don't go down into your feed dogs. And just sew ahead. I didn't do any back stitching in the beginning because that only creates bulk in the corners. I hold this seam back so that it doesn't flip forward when I'm approaching it. And sometimes you have to lift the presser foot to get the fabric laying just right. Use the stiletto as your extra finger so you can get close to the needle and sew directly over the point that you want to match up. Just like we've done the rest of the time, just simply iron that seam open and it'll lay nice and flat, and we ended up with a very nice point right there when we sewed directly over the intersections where the two seams met. The other side of the block is just simply repeating all of the steps that I've just shown you to do, just following the same techniques, and you'll keep sewing until you have 4 of those blocks put together. And like I told you in the beginning of the program, you sew 4 of the double X blocks together to get your 8-pointed star. After you have all of the stars sewn together, you're going to attach plain blocks in between like this. And when you sew those plain blocks onto the 8-pointed star, you would sew with this piece on the top instead of the plain on the top, because this piece has all of the intersections that you want to have perfect corners on. And I would probably put 1 pin in the beginning and 1 pin at the end of the seam so that the fabric didn't shift on me. This has been a lot of fun to share my ideas with you on how to keep organized when using scraps, and I hope that you try putting a scrap quilt together sometime. Just remember to choose your palette and keep organized throughout the whole process.